Our guest tonight, Clint Smith. Clint Smith is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of How the Word Is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, the Hillman Prize for Book Journalism, the Stowe Prize, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and selected by the New York Times as one of the 10 bestselling books of 2021. He is also the author of 2 books of poetry, the New York Times bestselling collection Above Ground, as well as Counting Descent. Both poetry collections were winners of the Literary Award Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and both were finalists for NAACP Image Awards. He is a staff writer at the Atlantic. There's more. Clint has received fellowships from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, New America, the Emerson Collective, the Art for Justice Fund, Ave Canem, and the National Science Foundation. His essays, poems, and scholarly writing have been published in the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, Poetry Magazine, the Paris Review, Harvard Educational Review, and elsewhere. He is a former National Poetry Slam champion and a recipient of the Jerome J. Shustat Prize from the American Poetry Review. Previously, Clint taught high school English in Prince George's County, Maryland, where he was named the Teacher of the Year by the Maryland Humanities Council. He is the host of the YouTube series Crash Course Black American History. He received his BA in English from Davidson College and his PhD in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Orleans, he currently lives in Maryland with his wife and their 2 children. Let's welcome Clint Smith.
How's everybody doing this evening?
Good.
I appreciate you all so much. I know that some of you are here because of your deep curiosity and passion for the written word and for history. Some of you are here for extra credit. But I appreciate all of you being here. And no, seriously, I say this at the beginning of every talk I give, but you know, we live in a technological moment in which there have never been more things to do with your time than there are now. Like, you can watch any movie that's ever been made, any TV show that's ever been made, listen to any song that's ever been made. You can scroll your phone endlessly. There's fewer and fewer reasons to leave home and your couch. And so for me, the idea that people still come to hear about books, ideas, and history is like a small miracle. You could all be home watching Love is Blind right now. Here with us. And I think that is so important, and maybe more important now than ever. I think our lives are becoming increasingly digital. And I think that these in-person experiences alongside one another are incredibly important. I also appreciate the people here on Zoom. It's not to say that you don't matter. Wherever you are, appreciate y'all. I know that some folks had to work. I took a selfie with somebody so they could prove that they came to their teacher. I think they had to catch their bus and go home. But I'm just happy to be here, and I'm happy to talk about a little bit about my work and hopefully hear some questions from you all. So I'm going to talk about my book, How the Word Is Passed, how it came to be, a little bit about the origin story and development of that project, and then we can go from there. So in 2017, I watched several Confederate statues come down in my hometown of New Orleans. Statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. Thinking, well, what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today, named after someone who owned hundreds of enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols, and names, and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. Those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. Those narratives shape public policy, and public policy is what shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that if you just take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee, or you change the name of Jefferson Davis Elementary School, you suddenly create more racially and economically egalitarian outcomes, more academically equal outcomes. But it does, I think, help us recognize the sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help ground our understanding of American history and help ground our understanding of the ways that certain communities have been intentionally and disproportionately harmed throughout American history. So I was thinking about this, and I was looking around New Orleans, I was looking around Louisiana, and I was trying to get a sense of, well, what are the people in New Orleans, what are the people in my home state that are attempting to tell the story honestly? What are the places that and people who are telling the story dishonestly? What are the people and places who are maybe doing something in between? And so I started traveling to different historic sites across Louisiana, and ultimately different historic sites across the country, visiting museums, monuments, plantations, prisons, cemeteries, neighborhoods, communities, where I could get a sense of how the story of slavery was being told in these different geographic and political contexts. One of the first places that I went, Monticello. And I went to Monticello. Many of you know Monticello as being the home of Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, intellectual founding fathers of this country. And it was important for me to go to Monticello, I think, because for me, Jefferson in so many ways embodies the cognitive dissonance, the American project, which is to say that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their own ancestors could have never imagined. It's also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated. And both of those things are the story of America. Not one over here, one over there, you pick this one, not pick that one. Both of those things are the story of this country. And Jefferson, I think, personifies the sort of moral inconsistency, we'll say, of America. He is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children, led by Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was 16 when she gave birth to his first child when he was in his 40s. Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and then wrote in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he said that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. It said the slave was incapable of love to the same extent that their white counterparts were. That the slave was incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. Wrote about Phillis Wheatley, the sort of foremother of African-American letters, the first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in the history of the United States. He said that her work was, quote, beneath the dignity of criticism. It wasn't even worth engaging with because he didn't believe that Black people had the necessary intellectual or emotional capacity with which to create art. And I think about that. I think about how that's a version of Jefferson that I was never taught. And I think about what's lost in our understanding of this country when we fail to understand the totality of who someone like Jefferson was. So what I'm doing when I go to these different places is I often go on in public history. I'm really interested in those public historians, how they tell the story of these histories, like the people who are technically on the front line of the conversations. 1 million people travel to Monticello every year. These guides, it's these docents, it's these public historians who are the ones who are communicating the story of Jefferson and the legacy of Jefferson to people who may never pick up a book like How the Word Has Passed, who may never read a book about slavery, but maybe they came to Monticello for a different set of reasons and can maybe encounter a history that they otherwise wouldn't have encountered. So when you go to Monticello, it's fascinating because, you know, Jefferson was an incredibly dynamic person. He was a philosopher, he was a statesman, he was a scientist, he was an enslaver, he was someone really interested in architecture. And so Monticello as an institution has myriad tours where one can explore the different facets of who Jefferson was. And so you can go on the horticultural tour, you can go on the cemetery tour, you can go on the house tour, you can go on the slavery tour, you can go on the Hemings family tour. So on the slavery tour, I went I was with a guy named David. David was the tour guide. He was older gentleman in his sort of early 70s, white man, sort of sun-kissed face from being outside all the time. He had a large, round brimmed hat, cast a shadow over his eyes, oversized white shirt, billowed in the wind, some khakis with a impressive crease down the middle. And David was telling a story to the group. There were about a dozen of us. And he was telling us a lot about the nature of Jefferson's entanglements with slavery. And he was sharing a lot with the group, a lot of the things I shared with you all, in terms of the sort of contradictions of much of Jefferson's intellectual and political project. And he was telling these stories, and he was telling stories about the way that Jefferson separated families, the way that he sold children and gave enslaved children as Christmas gifts to family members or to friends, separating them from their mothers and fathers. The way that he, when people tried to run away, he would have the slave catchers go and get them and bring them back and have them beaten as punishment. The way that he would have people working in his nail factory, hours and hours and hours and hours until they could barely stand anymore. Telling these stories, and I'm watching these two women, two white women named Donna and Grace, and they're watching David tell the story, and their faces are turning white, their mouths hanging agape. They're clearly really unsettled by what they're hearing. So I go up to them after David's presentation, and I introduce myself, and I introduce the project I'm working on. I say, it seems like you were really, really unsettled by what David was saying. I was wondering if you could share some of what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. And I'll always remember Donna turned to me and she was just like, man, really took the shine off the guy. She was just like, I had no idea. I had no idea Monticello was a plantation. These are folks who bought plane tickets, rented cars, got a hotel room, came to the site as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of one of the founding fathers, and yet had no idea that he was an enslaver. That was an important moment for me because it helped me recognize that even at this moment, which was in the midst, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in this country, there were still so many millions of Americans, Donna and Grace, who had no sense of the relationship between the founding of this country and enslavement, who had no sense of the founding fathers, as many of them, and the fact that many of them were slave owners themselves. The next place I went, one of the other places I went, was Angola Prison. Angola Prison is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It's Louisiana. It's 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. 75% of the people held there are Black men. 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. I was telling the folks earlier, both the faculty and the students today, that I'm working on a book, or I'm finishing a book, God willing, on World War II. And so if How the Word is Passed is thinking about how we remember and tell the story of slavery, Just Beneath the Soil, what comes out next year, is about how we remember and tell the story of World War II. I traveled to Japan, traveled to Korea, Germany, England, France, Argentina, Manzanar internment camp in California, a reservation in New Mexico, Camp Shelby in Mississippi. And when I went to Germany, which was among the first places I visited, went to the first concentration camp that the Third Reich, the Nazis, built during World War II, or before World War II. I remember walking over to Dachau, and walking through these heavy iron gates. Gravel is crunching beneath your feet. Walk in, and it's this vast, haunting expanse of empty gray land. You look to your left, see the remnants of the gas chamber where people were killed. To your right, you see the remnants of the crematorium. Bodies were burned. And I closed my eyes when I was there, and I tried to do this thought exercise. I tried to imagine what it would be like. On that land, they built a prison. And in that prison, the vast majority of the people held there were Jewish or of Jewish descent. I couldn't even finish the thought exercise. It was so upsetting. It was so abhorrent. It was so inconceivable to begin to imagine that Germany, with its history, would build a prison on top of a former concentration camp, where it might disproportionately incarcerate the descendants of the very people who had been exploited and killed on that land. It's impossible to imagine because they wouldn't do it. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country. The vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children, given that the United States is the only country that sentences children to life without the possibility of parole, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries. It's since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States for being an explicit vestige of white supremacy meant to sort of re-enslave, functionally re-enslave people after emancipation by forcing them to work as convict labor rather than as enslaved labor. People who are picking crops for virtually no pay, while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun laid across their lap. What does it mean that Angola has a gift shop? At the Angola gift shop, you can buy coffee mugs and shot glasses and t-shirts and sweatshirts, and stuffed animals dressed in prison uniforms. And on some of the designs of the t-shirts and the sweatshirts and the baseball caps, it has a silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, it reads, Angola, gated community, as if to make a mockery of, to belittle, to make fun of the experiences of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who were held there, died there, who were buried there. And I was there with a guy named Norris Henderson. Norris, remarkable man. He was incarcerated in Angola for almost 30 years for a crime he didn't commit. He's been out for about 20 years now. And he's one of the leading voices in the fight against mass incarceration across this country, one of the people who are ensuring that formerly incarcerated individuals have a seat at the table and talking about how to build a more equal, just criminal legal system. And I was with Norris, and we're having this visit. We go to the execution chamber where people are killed. We go to death row where people are held before they're brought to the execution chamber. We go to the law library. People are desperately through these law books, attempting to find a way to heal and exonerate themselves. We go to the Red Hat cell block, where the former electric chair that people would be killed on is still held. So we're going and having all these experiences. And one of the last places that we go is we're on the bus and we're leaving. We look off into the distance and we see these men working the fields. They're lifting their shovels into the air and digging them into the earth, lifting their spades into the air and digging them into the earth, lifting their garden hose into the air and digging them into the earth, digging, digging, digging. And they're surrounded by a group of guards who are on horseback with guns held over their shoulder. Norris looked at the men and he looked at me. He opened his hands. His hands had these calluses on them. All these years he spent working in the field. He was like, Clint, I can't begin to explain to you what it felt like to pick cotton for 7 cents an hour. I wonder if my same ancestors were on this land 200 years ago, doing the same thing that I'm doing right now. So for the people who are incarcerated at Angola, this history is not an abstraction, not a metaphor, it's not an intellectual exercise, it's not a white paper. It's in their bodies, it's in their bones, it's in the calluses in their hands. It's, as the scholar Saidiya Hartman talks about, it's the afterlife of slavery. How the remnants and the residue of slavery continue to shape our social, political, and economic infrastructure here today. Another place that I go is the Blandford Cemetery. Blandford Cemetery is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I went there for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration. As you can imagine, I was a conspicuous presence at such an event. And I didn't initially think that I was going to go to this Confederate cemetery. I thought I was going to write a chapter on Civil War battlefields. And so I went to Petersburg because I was going to write about the siege of Petersburg and the national park site that sort of commemorates this moment right before the end of the war and General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. And I was telling the park ranger there about my project and about the book I was working on. He was like, "Oh, that sounds really great. You should go to this Confederate cemetery down the road. Bet that would be great for your book." And it's almost like how in the movies when the devil and the angel appear on your shoulder, except for me, it's like regular Clint and writer Clint. Writer Clint is like, "You gotta go to the Confederate cemetery." And regular Clint is like, "We're absolutely not going to the Confederate cemetery. Go home and watch Love is Blind." And I'm grateful to be a writer because what it does is it forces me, pushes me to go to these places and to encounter these people that I would simply not do, or experiences I wouldn't have outside of a writerly context. And so I go to Blandford and I meet, spend time with members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And I remember a conversation I had with a guy named Jeff. And Jeff had this long salt and pepper ponytail, this handlebar mustache, this thick goatee, this round belly with a Confederate biker vest and paraphernalia all over it. And he was telling me about how when he was a boy, his grandfather would bring him to the cemetery. He and his grandfather would sit in this beautiful white gazebo at the center of the cemetery. His grandfather would pull out his old banjo, start singing these Dixie songs, these old Southern anthems. He's playing these songs and he would start telling stories about the men buried in these fields. And he would say, "You know, these men didn't fight a war over slavery. This secession had nothing to do with slavery. These men were courageous. They were brave. They were fighting to protect state sovereignty. They were fighting against tariffs. They were fighting against taxes. They were fighting against the imperialistic Yankee North who was kind of trying to come in and change our way of life. They were fighting against Abe Lincoln and his sort of authoritarian instinct." He's telling these stories and he's singing these songs and they're watching the sun set behind the trees. They're watching the sky turn from blue to orange to purple to black. Watching fireflies come out of the forest and hop from one tombstone to the next. Watching deer come from behind the trees and graze around the tombstones. These really intimate, sentimental memories. And Jeff said that now he brings his grandchildren to the same cemetery where his grandfather brought him to. He pulls out the same banjo, starts playing the same song, same banjo, starts telling the same stories about the same men who are buried in these fields, watches the same sun set behind the same trees. And so the thing is, I could go to Jeff, be like, "Jeff, man, look, I know your granddad told you, for example, secession had nothing to do with slavery. But all you have to do is look at the declarations of Confederate secession in 1861, where the states say very clearly why they're seceding from the Union. A state like Mississippi, for example, writes, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." They're not vague why they're seceding from the Union. They're very clear about it. But the thing is, if Jeff was to accept that information, he would have to accept that his grandfather was lying to him. If he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him, it threatens to disintegrate the foundation of a relationship that is central to who he understands himself to be in the world. So suddenly you're not just asking Jeff to do a casual reassessment of American history. You're giving him information that serves as a catalyst to an existential crisis, like a fundamental crisis of identity, because who Jeff understands himself to be in the world is shaped by the stories he's been told, by the people that he loves, the community that he's come from. And when you untether him from that story, you are untethering him from a reality that is grounded in his sense of who he understands himself to be in the world. So you're not just asking Jeff to do a casual reassessment of American history. It's an existential question. You know? And what it taught me is that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told. It's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. It's something where loyalty takes precedent over truth. And you see a similar thing. You know, I'm talking about this with the faculty earlier. You see a similar thing when you go to Monticello, right? Monticello, the docents at Monticello will tell you that every day somebody shows up and is like, "Why are you telling these woke stories about Jefferson? Why are you telling these PC stories about Jefferson, being all politically correct? Why are you telling these liberal lies about Jefferson? What they mean is, why are you talking about Jefferson and slavery? Because what happens is, when you have to tell a new story about Jefferson, you have to tell a new story about America. You have to tell a new story about America. For a lot of people, that means you have to tell a new story about yourself. That's deeply scary, deeply jarring, deeply untethering for a lot of people. So they reject it. They reject empiricism, they reject primary source document, they reject fact, because they would rather hold on to a story, a myth, a lie that allows them to tell a particular story about themselves, how they want to be situated, how they want their families, their memories to be situated in the world. One of the place that I go to end the book is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I go with my grandparents. My grandfather born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi. My grandmother born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. And we're walking through the museum. I'm pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair. The cane is laid across his lap. Grandmother's walking a few paces ahead of us. I have this moment where I'm watching them look at the exhibits in the museum. And I realize that so much of the history that is documented in this museum, things that they experience firsthand. And I asked my grandmother about it later, and she has this refrain. She keeps saying, lived it, lived it, lived it. And so what it reminds me of is that the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016, a woman named Ruth Bonner, she rang the bell alongside the Obama family to sort of signal the opening of this museum. She was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016, 10 years ago, was the daughter of a man who was born in slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 8-year-old and my 6-year-old sit on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. I'm reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago at all. We talk about slavery like it's something that existed in the Jurassic period. Like it was the dinosaurs, the Flintstones, and slavery all at the same time. It wasn't. Right? Like I think about this trip that I took to England a few years ago. It was in England, and we were visiting Oxford University. And Oxford, you know, it's a very prestigious, fancy university out in the UK. And we were getting a tour from the guide. He would go to these different buildings, and he would be like, this great poet wrote this poem in this building, or this great scientist conducted this experiment in this building. This great philosopher wrote this treatise in this building. Came to one building, and he looked at the building and looked at us, and looked at the building and looked at us. He was like, this one was built around 1020. In my head, I was like, AM or PM? Like, I couldn't even see the idea that he was talking about a building that had been built a millennium ago, that people were walking in and out of. But what I mean when I say that is that the US's history is so young, it's so recent compared to the rest of the world. We're like the annoying preteen of the world, increasingly so. But it's so important because for so many people, they try to suggest that that history has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality. They try to suggest that this history has nothing to do with the social, political, and economic landscape of disparities and inequality that exists today. But it has so much to do with the world we live in today. We are living in the aftermath of history, not the distant or abstract aftermath. We are living in the direct aftermath, only a few generations removed from that history. Again, there are people alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people who were born into chattel slavery. So I began this project thinking a lot about our collective physical proximity to this history, how the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape all around us. And I finished thinking a lot about our collective temporal proximity to this history, how this history that we're told was a long time ago, how this history that we're presented in our textbooks as, oh, it's this really sad thing, but it happened a long time ago. It has nothing to do with what's going on now. It has everything to do with the social, political, and economic infrastructure of our country today. I'm going to finish with a poem that is in many ways, the thing about when you're a poet who also writes nonfiction, sometimes you'll write a poem, really like that poem, and you'll turn the stanzas into paragraphs and throw it in the under one of your chapters and hope your editor doesn't notice. So this is both a poem, anyway, that gave birth to How the Word is Passed. But for me, our poetry is also an extension of my thinking. So I write poems as a way to get a clearer sense of what I think about something, both either externally or internally within myself. And so I was writing a lot of poems to get a clearer sense of what direction the book was meant to go in. And this poem brought me a level of clarity that I needed. And so this is at once a poem that made How the Word is Passed possible. But for those of you who read it, you'll also recognize much of it from the end of the Branford Cemetery chapter. And after this, we'll open it up for Q&A with you all. And Aaron, we'll go from there. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung over his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate battle flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of this city. These copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. They called it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. See, the thing about the lost cause, it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the Black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city that is filled with statues of white men on pedestals and Black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings that were named for Confederate soldiers and slaveholders. Every day, Black children would walk into buildings named after people who never wanted them to be there. Every time I returned home, I used to drive on streets named for those who wanted me in chains. Go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne. Translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of Black soldiers who were trying to surrender. Take a left on the president of the Confederacy who made the torture of Black bodies the cornerstone of his new nation. Make the first right on the man who mounted the heads of rebelling slaves on stakes and spread them across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you? Thank you.
think so. Thank you so much. You have students on Zoom and folks here. And we'd love to open up the floor to questions. Would anybody like to get started?
We spoke a little bit briefly, then thank you for being here. I think about your chapter about the prison system and for profit and how it is an industry, right? And I think one of the things that I struggle with a lot right now is watching deportation centers get built. And the irony behind the word deportation center, because if deportation was the end goal, then why do we need to invest $40 billion into these centers? And I thought about what you just said of how to change people's not only narrative in their own mind, but how to change what they think of themselves as. Right? And one of my favorite quotes right now, that I don't do politics. And the entire world is politics, right? Like it is around us. So I'm wondering how you think about having a conversation with somebody about that we're watching this expand in front of us once again, right? Like history is repeating itself once again in a deportation center. And how do you even approach that when somebody is so caught up with their own selves? And I know you did it in your book, and I know you talked about that, but I feel like I really am struggling with that internally because it seems so big, and then someone's like, I just want to go home and watch Love is Blind. Okay, good, do it, but understand that like what is happening around you is terrible, right? So I'm curious how you would approach that.
So more of a, like, how do you navigate these conversations with someone who is sort of disengaging themselves rather than somebody?
I think both of it. I think that we live in such a defeating world that I think you're seeing more people just choose to distance themselves because they feel like, what does it matter, right? Like, what can I do? And I work in politics and I feel that way sometimes. But it's like, wow, like what change are you really going to make? But so not to put you on the spot, I guess both, right? Somebody that feels like I have no voice, or somebody that is so dug into their own self and saying, like, I did vote for this. This is what I want, right? This is a good thing that's happening as we're watching children in bunny ears be taken out big handcuffs. And somebody like, how do you approach somebody that says this is a good thing that's happening?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, there's two different things I'm hearing. So for people who, my posture is not one in which I'm not engaged in the project of trying to convince people who are ideologically opposed to my values or position. I'm not in the, my project is not to try to convince them to come to my side. I think it's not that I don't believe that persuasion works or is meaningful, but I tend to think, and I am interested less so in those of whom think that that is a good thing. But like the deportation of a 5-year-old is something that they support. But I'm more interested in talking to the people who, and I think it's a larger number of people who maybe are not cognizant of the sort of historical parallels, the historical echoes, who are open to sort of reconceiving of what justice can look like, what politics can look like, what our country, what our world can look like. And for me, part of it is the posture with which you approach people. And so something that I did in How the Word is Passed, for example, when I went to the Confederate cemetery, I was not approaching them with a disposition of antagonism. Right? I wasn't going to attack them. I wasn't going to bombard them. I wasn't going to try and do like a Daily Show, make you look silly or dumb kind of thing. What I did was approach with a disposition of curiosity. And I tried to ask questions.
And I think sometimes when because if I had approached with an antagonistic position, I think they would have shut down. And it actually wouldn't have been fruitful for me because I wouldn't have gotten information that would have taught me anything about, or showed me anything new. And so for me, if I was like, I genuinely want to understand how someone who believes something that is clearly so false and so misguided and so ahistorical, like how does someone continue to believe that thing? And so in that context, I guess they're actually more like the folks who say like, this is a good thing. And if I were having a conversation with that person, I would do less of a like, you're so evil, you're so dumb, how could you? I might feel those things. But if I'm actually interested in some sort of revelation, in some sort of getting them to like personally excavate an explanation that may be illuminating to me or illuminating to them, then I think the asking of questions is the way to do it. And, you know, for example, part of what happens when you ask these questions is sometimes you force a person to explain to themselves or justify to themselves something that they might not have actually taken the time to fully consider. And and this is, you know, comes from my time in journalism, I guess, is like you ask a question and a follow-up question, and not in a way that's meant to be put them on the defensive, but to genuinely ask them, to pull from within them an explanation that itself might indict them in ways that they hadn't fully considered before. And they're not in that moment going to be like, actually, you were right, Clint. Like, I've been so misguided this whole time. Let's go to Starbucks. You want like a latte? It doesn't work like that, right? But you might plant something in their heads by forcing them to explain to you and to themselves how and why they hold a certain position. To the folks who are like, you know, feeling disengaging because they don't believe they can do anything. The thing I think about all the time is how the first enslaved people came to the British colonies that would become the United States in 1619. Slavery ended in 1865 formally. And what that means is that, you know, for 250 years, slavery existed. And what that also means is that, you know, from the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, we know they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. They were fighting for emancipation. And it means that the vast majority of people spent their lives fighting for something that they knew they would never see. But they fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think all the time about how my life is possible, how my children's lives are only possible because of generations of people who fought for something they knew they might never see, but who fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. I think what responsibility does that bestow upon me to attempt to build the sort of world that I might not see myself, that my children might not see themselves, but to try to build that world anyway because that is what was done for me. It's almost like we're all, you know, we all have these chisels and we're all chiseling away at this wall. As you're chiseling, you don't know if the wall is 6 inches thick, 6,000 miles thick. What you know is that the more you chip away at it, the less people who come after you will have to chip away. And for me, we only ever get to the other side of the proverbial wall because people are chipping, chipping, and chipping, and chipping. Like we are all of us are only in this room because of the generations of people who came before it who made it possible for us to be here, right? So the future, our kids and grandkids and great grandkids, like their lives will only be what they are based on what we do now to create that reality. And so I accept that I'm part of an intergenerational project. And it sometimes means that like I'm not going to see the fruit of my labor. Like I might want to live in a world I certainly want to live in a world very different than the one that we're living in right now. And what is true is that I might spend the rest of my life trying to work to undo some of the damage of what I think has been done over the last 14 months. But that's what I have to do, because that's what people who came before me did for me, and did under more unfathomable circumstances, frankly, than I did. So the least I can do is chip, even when it feels like you're never gonna get to the other side of that wall. But what we know, because we know we're part of this intergenerational lineage, is that we have to do that. Because that's what was done for us.
I have one on the chat, so I'm gonna use the mic to read it so everyone can hear it, and then we'll go back to the in-person audience. So Alfred asks, why are politicians trying to deny what really happened to the enslaved by rewriting the actual truth to suppress history?
I think that part of the reason is because, as I said before, if you have to tell a new story about America, it means you have to tell a new story about yourself. I think a lot of people are scared not only to tell a new story about themselves from the vantage point of like their identity, their sense of self, but also from like from the perspective of like material resources and political power, right? Because if you have to reassess the story of America, you have to reassess the deservedness of like who has political power, who has financial power, and who doesn't. And then you have to accept that that's not the sort of arbitrary nature of who is working the hardest for it and who hasn't. You accept that that is the result of decades and centuries of public policy and judicial decisions and legislative decisions and things that have created the conditions in which some people's hard work is rewarded in ways that other people's hard work is not. I think all the time about the New Deal, and the New Deal is the one of the most, it's the great catalyst of wealth in the 20th century for millions of Americans. And it is the thing that when I was taught about it, it was the thing that lifted millions of Americans into the middle class from poverty, coming out of the Depression. And that's true. And what's also true is that the vast majority of people who had access to the New Deal were white. Like Black people did not have access to the benefits that the New Deal afforded because the New Deal policy was implemented on a state level. And the only way that FDR could pass it was making a deal with the Dixiecrats in the South to say that they could apply Jim Crow sort of frameworks to that legislation and could functionally decide in their states that Black people would not get in. So because this is the early 20th century and the vast majority of Black people are still in the South, the vast majority of Black people in this country didn't get access to Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing, mortgages, all of these different, the GI Bill, all these different things that ultimately became the foundation of the middle class in the 20th century and into the 21st century. So you give the greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth over the course of a century to one group of people, and you very intentionally don't give it to another group of people, and then people want to act surprised generations later when there are disparate outcomes along the lines that these resources were allotted. And that's but one example, right? The New Deal is one example of hundreds of public policy decisions that prevented Black Americans from having access to the levers of upward economic and social mobility that their white counterparts often had access to. And so, in the context of slavery and that part of American history, I think it's a thing in which if you have to stress this, the thing is, if the way that we tell the story of America is one that like allows you to I was asked about George Washington earlier. And in order to understand George Washington, you have to understand the totality of who George Washington was. You have to understand him as enslaver, you have to understand him as Continental General, you have to understand him in the context of Mount Vernon, you have to understand him in the context of the White House. So you have to hold the fullness, you have to hold the truth of who he was in order to understand that part, that facet of the American story. And if you don't understand the totality of who he was, you misunderstand the founding of America. And you misunderstand the sort of founding principles of America and who was meant to be included or who was not meant to be included. You can apply that to Thomas Jefferson, you can apply that to, you know, so many of the enslavers who also became the presidents. My sense of this is that it is not so much that these folks don't believe that George Washington owned enslaved people, or Thomas Jefferson owned enslaved people, or that slavery was bad, or that slavery, or they don't think slavery existed. I think they do. They recognize slavery existed. They recognize slavery was bad. But I think they recognize that the more people understand how central and how foundational enslavement was to America, the more it allows people to understand the present day in like a fundamentally different way. It allows a connection to be made between past and present that provides a sort of explanation for the contemporary landscape of inequality in ways that are informed by history, right? Because part of what happens is you study history. And then you start to look around and you're like, oh, the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but it's because of what has been done to those, or what has been extracted from those communities, generation after generation after generation. And so I believe that efforts to prevent people from learning about this history are largely efforts to prevent people from making connections between the past and present. Like if they believe that people can learn about slavery and think of it as something that had nothing to do with the world that we live in today, I don't think they would care.
Right.
The problem is that if you learn about slavery, you recognize that it does have so much to do with the world we live in today. And then that, again, forces you to ask new questions about who's in positions of political power, who has positions, who has certain types of financial power, social capital, and that disrupts the sort of the order, the hierarchy, the totem, in ways that people are deeply invested in preserving.
Yeah, if I can add to that. Kind of, that was actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because you know, if you think about the book connects the dots between our past and our present. And if we think about why that's potentially threatening, it's empowering. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that history as empowerment.
Oh yeah, I mean, I told this story before, but like part of the reason I wrote How the Word is Passed is because I wanted to write the storybook that I felt like I needed in my high school American history class. Like I was like, what is the book that would have helped me make sense of this country and my position within this country, and would have given me the language and the historical context, the intellectual toolkit with which to more fully understand America. And because I remember I was a kid growing up in New Orleans in the 90s, and just being inundated with all these messages about all the things that were wrong with Black people. The reason there was so much violence, poverty, crime was because of something that Black people had done wrong or something Black people had failed. And when you're a kid and you're inundated with this information and you don't have anything with which to push back against it, when you don't have the history with which to be like, oh no, this is because of a cultural disposition. This isn't because of, you know, even more insidiously, you know, genetics or biology. This is because of policies like redlining and like the, you know, who the GI Bill wasn't given to, and housing covenants and bank loans, and the list goes on and on and on. If you don't know any of that, then people will tell you that you are what's wrong. And you won't know how to say that you aren't the problem. And I remember that feeling when I was a kid, that like the world was telling me that there was something wrong with me and my community and my loved ones and my neighborhoods. And it was like emotionally paralyzing. Because I knew that what I was hearing was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it. And it wasn't until I began to study history deeply, that I began to read history and scholarship and journalism and art, film, informed by history, that I was able to look back at the pathology that I have been inundated with and recognize it for the lies that it was, right? Recognize it for the distortion that it was. But if you don't have history to help explain how we got here, then you fall into the trap of believing that, like, oh, the world, these people have this because they must have worked hard. These people must not have this because they must have not worked harder. Maybe these people are more violent because their culture is more violent. Or maybe like it allows those sort of narratives to persist and to exist, even when they are deeply untrue. But what you're doing, and part of what we're doing now is, I mean, what we have historically been doing is fighting against like a long history that has been telling us lies. And it is only actually like a brief window of American history in which we've even been able to tell like a fuller truth. Like people don't appreciate that from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the Civil Rights Movement, let's say the Voting Rights Act in 1965, so that century, that like the most predominant story of slavery was that it was a benevolent institution, that slaves were treated well, that they were like children, and they were taken care of, and that it was a sort of something that was it gave them God, it gave them religion, it gave civilization, it was a civilizing institution, as one important scholar put it. And that wasn't like a few people said it. That was like what was in the textbooks. Like that, it wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement, a new generation of historians came and were like, that's wild, right? And like, because you have to think, and this is why history is so important. Also, the primary sources that people were using to make sense of history or to tell that history were the newspaper articles and the letters and stuff written by enslavers. Because if you prevent a group of people from learning how to read and write, they don't have hundreds of years, for many generations, they don't have, with the exception of your Douglass or your, the sort of slave narratives that became really important and really popular. But those are like the exception to the rule. So you largely didn't have written primary sources with which to tell a new story about slavery. But then scholars started using oral histories, and they started taking seriously the sort of stories that have been passed down over generations. And I say all this to say that history, you talk about history being empowering. Like the reason I write history, the reason I study history, the reason I try to learn about history is because of how empowering it is. It's almost like when you don't know history, to me, it almost feels like you're walking through fog. And you don't know, it's like unclear where you're going. You don't know where the fog ends and where it begins. You don't know which direction you're going. You're lost, you're confused. And learning history is almost like, if you excuse the unwieldy metaphor, transforming that fog into like a heavy stone. And people will say like, oh, isn't it hard to like, go to all these places and learn this? My friends are always like, Clint, where are you going to go on your sad tour next? Prisons, genocide, war. I go to these places because for me, if I know of it but don't understand it, it feels like walking through fog. If I understand it, it may become heavy, but at least now I can see it. I can carry it. And it might be a weight. It might feel heavy. It might be hard to carry, hard to move forward with. But at least I can see it, I can hold it, I can control it, I can make sense of it now. And so that's how I feel. I feel like the process of writing this book was like transforming, over the course of 4 years, from like walking through fog to walking with a stone. And just think the soil has been the same thing, right? World War II, I couldn't have told you anything 4 or 5 years ago about Japanese American incarceration, code talkers, you know, the experience of black soldiers in the military, atomic bomb survivors in Japan, conflict in South Korea. Like I didn't. But now, when you learn it, also the thing it does is allow you to be like, you learn how Japan tries to obscure its history as it relates to China and Korea. You're like, Japan's got its own lost cause, right? And it allows you to make these connections between different parts of the world. And Du Bois had a similar experience. In 1955, he wrote about visiting Warsaw. And he was walking through the former Warsaw ghetto. And it was this powerful experience of coming to recognize the sort of interconnectedness of oppression, right? Because suddenly he was like, my whole life I thought that the Black American question was like the central question, the central and most devastating oppression, iteration of oppression that exists in the world. But part of what going to Poland did, this place where 3 million Jewish people were killed, 99% of the Jewish population in Poland just slaughtered in a handful of years. He was able to establish connections between the anti-Semitism in Europe and anti-Blackness in America and imperialism in Asia, and began to, he says it, stripped him of a social parochialism, right? Like it expanded his understanding of the interconnectedness of oppression in ways that made him a more global and cosmopolitan thinker. And I think that I've been on a similar journey over the course of the last 4 years, understanding the relationship between all these different, like between genocide in Rwanda and the atomic bomb in Japan and the internment camps in California, and my uncle, both experiencing Jim Crow and deciding to fight for the country that was lynching people in his community while it was happening. All of these things, there's a connection between all of them. And that's history. You only are able to establish those connections when you learn these histories. And when you study history, you're never bored. There's always more history to learn. Like Ken Burns keeps making documentaries. Endless list of possibilities.
So how do you, I'm gonna give you the microphone and then I am going to, hi. And then we could stay here talking all night. I think people would love that, but this is probably gonna be our last question.
I have a question, so. So how do you navigate like in this process of like relearning and like uncovering truth? But like the truth has this weird way of also breaking your ability to trust the systems that you're brought up to be dependent on.
Mhm.
And as someone who finds that like academics and learning is like my way of just navigating life, I've gotten to this point where sometimes even as a student here, I'll be reading material and like asking myself, like, can I really trust this? Can I trust the way that this is being presented to me? Like, for example, in my developmental psychology course, I like was at first really excited to realize that like I was taking a class that was like really focused on cultural influences in psychology. But then the more I went through the course, I was like, this is actually a really weird way of presenting like cultural inclusivity. It's kind of having the opposite effect. And yeah, I guess I feel this like constant uneasiness when I'm navigating like any informational space at this point. How do you feel that? And if you do, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, no, I hear you for sure. And it can be exhausting. But it also means that you are you've reached so I was gonna say a different level of consciousness, but that sounds like. But there is, I mean, there's a reason that Baldwin, talks about how like the more you study American history or the more you learn, the more time you spend in school, the angrier you get. He's like, yeah, you learn more and then you're like, you get more and more upset. And then you, to your point, get more and more upset about how you're being taught about these other things. So you're not only mad at the subject matter, you're mad at the people teaching the thing, and you're mad at the institutions that empower people. So it's hard, and you gotta find ways to, I think it is important to always be mindful. I don't want you to lose that, right? Because it's critical thinking, right? Like that's what it is. So it's like you're developing critical thinking, you're developing an ability to discern, which is honestly more important now than it has ever been. Because we live in a digital ecosystem where like I literally cannot get on my social media and tell you what's real and what's not. Like in the age of AI, right? Like the notion of critical thinking and media literacy, like, I mean, I saw a video, and it's like benign stuff. Like there was a 5th grader who dunked, and I was like, 5th graders can't dunk. Like, I was like, is that AI? And then there was somebody who was boxing with a kangaroo. Wild. And I was like, that's wild. And I was like, is that AI? Like, you just don't know. Like but then also there's like people who are making fake videos of confrontations between ICE and protesters. Right? There's also people who are making fake videos of people surging into the streets of Caracas after Maduro is arrested, which turned out not to be so we are moving into we are in a dangerous world, and we're moving to an even more dangerous world in which we can't trust much of what we see. And so I think the impulse is one that you need to hold on to. But you do have to, figure out how to give yourself breaks. And to, you also, part of that discernment, I think, is deciding when and when not to engage in a sort of, or engage or confront, right? Like, because there are moments where you're like, I need to, I'm reading this thing in developmental psychology, and I actually need to go tell the professor like that this has got to change. And sometimes that might be the case. There are also moments where you might maybe take like in a different context, not necessarily this one, that discernment leads you to sort of do your own assessment or do your own homework or do your own fact checking, but in a way that also allows you to kind of like sustain the discernment, right? Because everything can't be like you're fighting against the machine, like fighting against the, because every moment it's this sort of like push against the system, so to speak. You will lose steam for yourself. And so it's not only discerning the information, but also discerning within yourself when it demands confrontation, when it demands way of a certain level of engagement, and when you just got to be like, I'm going to keep it moving. You got to protect your peace also.
I think that's a beautiful place to stop, is to find ways. I'm so sorry, we only have Dr. Smith for about 15 more minutes, and what we were going to do next, and maybe if you wanted to bring a book up to get it signed, we have some books for sale if you don't already have a book. So if you do already have a book, if you can start to form a line up this aisle, and he can sign that for you. If you don't, if you'd like to come around this way, and there's a QR code, you can scan it to pay what you can. And then Maria will give you a book. And so can we get a big round of applause? Thank you so much. And I like all of this one. Yeah, I'll grab a pen. And I just also want to thank you all on behalf of our Center for Community Equity and Inclusion. I also want to give a huge thank you to Maria Ortiz Cintron who without her, these districts would not happen. So thank you, Georgia. And yes, and you've got a stack of books to say.
Lots of slavery, you know? Mike, how you doing? I'm glad you made it. How'd you like it?
Yeah, I'm a little bit.
Spoken okay. I came and did your education last year
Yeah.
with the students from Nobel. Good to see you.
Talk about slavery.
We are.
Say that.
Yeah.
Oh, what did they say?
Like.
The same.
So much.
Yeah. You know what date it is?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're going to do this. No worries.
Yeah. I'd love to, I mean.
Oh, yeah.
Actually just,
Sorry, I brought two outside.
on the panel too, I feel. Yeah, just.
Yes, Daniel called, yeah.
He messaged me, he's doing like an Ed's channel here, and he's like, do you wanna, it's the same way that advocacy.
Yes.
Yeah, please,
Yeah, have you been?
Other than that, like, it's a weird time. Like the funding of education, everything's like. Education voters, we deal primarily it's K. We'll have to now.
But, education. Okay, yeah.
My question, because thank you so much. Feel bad, just like I didn't. I'm on, are they alumni?
Oh.